Hi everybody, it's Cash. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me today. I wanted to respond to a question that I get asked not often in the comment section, but intermittently, certainly, from people wondering whether we have any kind of choice in the sort of transition we have when we die. And the reason I haven't provided an answer to this is because I simply didn't know. Nobody had come up yet, no subject for a transition, who provided any kind of insight into that issue until now. Somebody did, a guy called Stuart Wilde. He was a metaphysical writer, incredibly enlightened. He used to pal around with Wayne Dyer, Louise Hay, Deepak Chopra, people like that, but never seemed, to my eyes anyway, to be an A-lister in the same way as them. And the reason was because, and this is just my theory, but the reason was because he was a fringe thinker to a certain extent, very original. He would see things that had been talked about a million times and have a fresh take on them. And this can be daunting to people who like the conventional thing fed to them. I'll give you an example. When I did my Law of Attraction book, there are so many Law of Attraction books out there, and I thought, I suppose I could rehash those, but why bother, really, when I could approach the subject from a new angle and do something very different? And so that's what I did. And I think Stuart Wilde was a leader in that kind of approach. He wrote quite a few books in his time that were incredibly insightful and popular all over the world, with titles like The Little Money Bible and The Trick to Money is Having Some. And also one of my favourites, Life Was Never Meant to Be a Struggle. But he gave lectures, he recorded audiobooks and so on, and managed to put forward this very esoteric set of theories and principles he devised in the most accessible way possible. He really believed that we humans have capacities and potential that we have never explored, that we are connected to the cosmos and the divine in all kinds of different ways that we just don't know about. We never give ourselves the chance to go into those areas. And his books were full of these theories and principles and ideas and so on, more so as he grew older. He died in 2013 at the age of 66. I think he was motoring around Ireland at the time and had a heart attack. Not absolutely sure he took great care of himself. He was quite the smoker when I met him, and he didn't look like a guy who cared so much about the physical as he did about the metaphysical. But he's also the kind of person who might have something to say about how we transition to the metaphysical. And this is what really interested me. Can we choose how we go? Before I tell you what happened to him, though, I'd like to mention briefly somebody else, a guy called Sri Aurobindo. He was an Indian guru, yogi, philosopher, journalist as well. I think he published magazines or newspapers, and very, very politically active in his time. He died in 1950 at the age of 78. He had some kind of urine bladder problem that ultimately saw him off. But when he did die, he left behind many, many disciples who still honor his work to this day. And the reason he came to light, actually, was because somebody mentioned him. And when I looked him up, it turned out that he, when he was a kid in the 19th century, he lived in London about 2 streets away from where I ended up living in London. And I thought, well, that's fascinating. He lived just down the road, basically. And I looked at his transition pictures because somebody asked, and this was fascinating for a reason not unrelated to the Stuart Wilde transition. So let me just tell you this first. When I went into the energy of Sri Aurobindo, there he is, he was lying on a table, but it could also have been an altar, I suppose, signifying worship, that he was worshipped by people or mourned deeply by people. He was just lying there. He had no participation in this whatsoever. And I don't think was terribly interested in all that kind of thing. Because as I watched, his spirit rolled out of his physical form, off the table, off the altar thing, onto the floor. As if to say, I'm done with all of that. Enough fuss, enough mourning, enough worry. I gotta go. Leaving his worldly ties and responsibilities, and presumably his illness as well, and any pain he was in, behind. Just turning his back on it. Ahead of him was the tunnel that I often see in these kinds of pictures. It's a sort of conduit, an umbilical between form and formless, between the now and the hereafter. People walk down it, they crawl down it, they go down it in various ways, but they are at this point transitioning from the world of mortality to the world of spirituality. And that's what he did. The only difference in his case was that it was a service duct. It was very, very down to earth. There was nothing mystical about it for such a guru, philosopher, and mystic and so on. It's kind of strange. Maybe he was also extremely pragmatic, worldly in his way, which helped him relate to people, but there were pipes and cables lying around that he had to step over as he went. But ultimately, he ended up in that cave I always see. It's not real, it's metaphorical, it's symbolic, but it's where people tend to go after they have crossed over. The most interesting thing, though, and this is the point I'm getting to, the most interesting thing about his crossover was that that symbolic cave had something in it that I had not seen before. There was a figure, a lone figure, thin and tall, very, very tall, dressed in robes, a bit like Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, but dressed in robes, suspended in the middle of the space, just hanging there as he arrived. I don't know who this represented. God or Sri Aurobindo's own guru, master or whatever, but he was very relieved to see this person and expected to see this person in some form. Because as he knelt before this figure, the words came, obviously they don't speak, but the words came, "Oh, thank goodness you're here." That kind of thing. We can go together. He was expecting to meet this person, whoever it was, this spirit, and travel together up the tunnel with him. I was pretty sure it was a man. And he waited for some kind of affirmative response, some reciprocated greeting or gesture. But the figure, which had a hood on of some kind, didn't move. Was just silent and still. Sri Aurobindo waited some more, and still nothing happened. And he had a realization, and I don't actually hear people speaking or anything really, but I got words as if Grace was saying, no, you have to travel this journey alone. Maybe in the mortal world you had masters and gurus and guides and followers, disciples and acolytes or whatever. Maybe you had those, but now this is your soul journey completing itself. You have to travel alone. And he got up and he walked the tunnel, leaving this figure, this Gandalf-like berobed figure, dangling silently in the cave, and he just strode up towards the light. But disappointed initially, and I thought afraid at some level. His expectations of how things would go, his design for the transition had gone awry. It wasn't what he thought or what he'd been taught would happen. And while he was confident that it would all go according to his plan, having found that his plan wasn't panning out the way he thought it would, he was left with a measure of fear. Oh no, what lies ahead? So we can't plan that according to some religious or other belief system. That's what that seems to tell us. But anyway, back to Stuart Wilde, because his transition takes that one step further. When I went into Stuart Wilde's energy, remember he had a heart attack while in a car in Ireland. When I went into his energy, there he is, he was suddenly yanked backwards on 2 wires. Suggesting, of course, that the heart attack was unexpected. It was sudden. Maybe he wasn't feeling very well generally, but it was very, very sudden. As he was pulled back, he entered a tunnel, as I said, like they always do. But he banged his head as if it were rock, so there must have been some element of pain for him. But he hurtled backwards down it, cutting out all the protocol, any cosmic red tape. There was no delay. He was just here 1 minute, and then he was gone, in cosmic terms. And he landed at the entrance to that cave that I always see, that symbolic cave. It was as if he had been dropped into a woodland glade where there was so much fresh air that it got him tipsy. It was almost like he was inebriated with this fresh air. Having been a smoker during his life, maybe that was something to do with his lungs, but he felt exhilarated. I wanted to laugh and dance. He met this experience with such a joyful, open heart that it was a pleasure to watch. He must have regarded his explorations, his investigations, his thought processes while he was alive into this whole metaphysical arena and Taoism and whatever else. He must have regarded that as a training exercise for what came next. Because in his head, this was like a checklist of, wow, I thought that would happen, and it did. And I thought this would be the case, and it is. He was elated. He walked into the cave area just laughing. Yes, this is what I thought. He felt liberated, able to breathe, elevated. I don't remember anybody else going through this to that extent, who embraced it so fully as though it was the punctuation at the end of a sentence that he'd written himself very carefully. And he was just checking the grammar. He went up the tunnel a little way, and then strangely walked back down again, and then back up again, and then back down again. He seemed to be, evaluating what he was doing. Like, oh, I see, so there's that, and then there's that. That's the connection to the mortal. This is the connection to the immortal and the infinite. It's like he had a checklist, just going through it, making sure he was right. His preconceptions were right on the nail, I thought, whatever they had been. And then he just set off up the tunnel. But then came the weird thing about this transition that makes Stuart Wilde unique in this process so far for all the ones I've done. This is going to sound weird to begin with, but just bear with it. Halfway up the tunnel, it did a little dogleg thing. It kind of curved around and went on. So there was some kind of adjustment needed to be made. But before he ever got there, I saw a xylophone, a glockenspiel thing on the wall. He was not surprised to see this. He walked up to it, picked up the little stick things, and knocked out a tune. A bit like the 5 tones in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He knocked out this prearranged tune. Now, obviously, not really. But I did wonder, as some kind of metaphor for what he was going through, whether he hadn't said to himself, at some point, internally, quietly, not telling anybody else, when I transition, I'm going to do this. You know, like some people say, if there is life after death, I will come back and I will give you a sign. That kind of thing. But this was a sign to himself, I think. When I am in the process of dying and my consciousness is dwindling away, before I finally go, I am going to confirm this process, according to my checklist, confirm this process by doing this, by thinking this thought, by playing this tune. It was like ding, 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 ding. Job complete. He put the little sticks down and walked off. Around this bend, that was interesting because that suggested that he had to adjust his thinking about something. Something wasn't quite right. It wasn't plain sailing. It was like, oh, now this I didn't know about. He couldn't see straight ahead. He had to go round the bend of the corridor. Then there was a step up. Steps usually relate in the pictures to challenges of some kind, as if he had to make an adjustment because there was an extra factor involved that he hadn't considered. This was something new or another dimension to what he'd been anticipating, that kind of thing. But he dealt with it and marched on. At the end of the tunnel was the dome of light that I always see in these pictures, or usually see in these pictures. Only in his case, it was gold. The dome was gold. He could see his reflection in the shiny surface as he peered into it. This was a wondrous paradise situation for him. The only welcoming committee he needed. Yes! His soul had led him to this point, and it didn't disappoint. To me, looking at it, it felt, I know this is going to sound awful, it felt a bit tacky, a bit cheap. A bit like a low-end casino environment. Where, yeah, it's brightly lit. Yeah, it's got gold everywhere. But it's a little bit tacky. It's just not right. It's just too much. They've gone over the top. It felt over the top. Compensatory in some kind of way. To me. But for him, it was glorious. I did wonder, actually, whether it was really about a poor boy who made good and appeared to the world to be a fabulously knowledgeable and wise guru, but on the inside, deep down, he felt a bit like a fake, maybe? That he was fooling people and his roguish charm was getting him a long way when really, at a far deeper level, he didn't feel that way. Something like that. I mean, we all have those kinds of insecurities. But that was how it ended for him. He peered at his reflection and thought, yes, this is the perfect end. And with the same amount of joy he had expressed from the get-go, he stepped into the dome and was gone, filled with joy and excitement at the prospect of what lay ahead. And that was Stuart Wilde. When I met him, I went to his workshop in Fulham. He was in Fulham at the time. And he had a sparkle in his eye of mischief, as if he was thoroughly enjoying the moment, but knew something else that the rest of us didn't know. He was a spectacularly unique fringe dweller who was exploring ideas that were way beyond humanity's readiness to accept them. But I think he was right. I think we do have the capacity to link to the universe in all kinds of ways that we just don't take the time to explore. And if we did, and if we explored more of Stuart Wilde's investigations into these things, we might expand our consciousness and be able to connect to different dimensions and so on in ways that we can't do now. And that's what I learned from Stuart Wilde.